I haven't seen this movie, so I don't know if I can recommend it or not, but I was recently introduced to the storyline of a movie by the name of Marvin's Room. Now, Marvin's Room is about two sisters, Lee and Bessie. Now, after 17 years of estrangement, Bessie discovers she has leukemia, and Lee, though generally very self-centered, visits her sister and to try to see if she will be a bone marrow match. Now, despite her illness, Bessie, true to her form, continues to care for her ailing aunt and her father. When Bessie learns that Lee is not a match, she tries to remain calm, but she accidentally knocks over a bottle of pills off of the counter. The pills and the bottle spill over onto the floor, and staring blankly at the pills, Lee asks Bessie if she wants to lie down, but Bessie refuses. And they both bend down and facing each other, they start to pick up the pills. Now Bessie steals a quick glance at Lee's teary-eyed face. And Lee looks up and they catch each other's eye. And a warm and gracious smile exudes from Bessie's face, silently thanking Lee for her concern. She reassures Lee, "Oh Lee, I've been so lucky to have Dad and Ruth. I've had such love in my life. I look back and I've had such love." Lee nods. She says, "They love you very much." Bessie gently shakes her head and she says, "No, that's not what I mean. No, I mean I love them. And I've been so lucky to have been able to love someone so much." I want you to think about that for just a moment. I've been so lucky to be able to love someone so much. That's not normally how we think about love, is it? I mean, that's not normally the parameters by which we determine if we're lucky in love or not. Most of the time we think, well, I've been so lucky that someone has loved me much. Or I've been so lucky in love that I found a spouse who loves me. Or I've been so lucky that I had the great parents that I had who raised me in love. Or I've been so lucky that I've been accepted by a group of friends who care about me and love me. Truth is, usually when we think about love, it's about us being loved more than about us having the opportunity to love. In fact, we're taught to define love by how it makes us feel. We're taught to define love by what we get out of love. But God calls us to a different way of loving. Last week we saw that love, God's love expressed to the world, a world that was in rebellion against Him. We saw how His love was costly and how He was blinded to our failures, and maybe that's not even the right way. He saw our failures and yet still loved us. We saw last week what I like to call, or what the Bible calls, agape love. Some call it Christian love. It is a love that stands strong no matter what. It is a love that focuses on others rather than self. And it is the very love that is described in the chapter in the Bible that we all would call the chapter of love. And in 1 Corinthians 13, this is what it says about that love. It says, "Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends." What God displayed last week to all mankind in John chapter 3, verse 16, now we will see God the Son live out on the very night of His last Passover meal on earth. We are continuing our series entitled Love, A Journey to the Cross. And today we will look at the love that Jesus had for His disciples on that very night, on the night He would be betrayed. And so if you have your Bible, turn with me to John chapter 13. If not, it'll be on the screen. But I just want to read to you the first 5 verses, and this is what it says. John 13, the first 5 verses. It says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, he rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. And then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him." In John 13, the first 5 verses, we see the love of God in action. It is a powerful display of how Jesus felt about these men that he had spent 3 years doing ministry with. What a display to the world around him. Jesus is displaying his love for his disciples. And I want you to understand the truth is they were more than just disciples. The text calls them loved. He loved his own. These were more than friends or students. These were his own. These were his family. In fact, in Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 46, it says, "While he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, 'Who is my mother and who are my brothers?' And stretching out his hand toward his disciples, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother.'" See, the disciples to Jesus were his family. They were family. They were the ones he loved. And in fact, we here, if we've accepted Jesus and are obedient to him, we too are family. We are also the ones that he loves. So let's look at how Jesus loved his own, his disciples, and to be quite honest, us included in that. Jesus gives us this powerful example about loving family. And so here's what we need to understand today. Loving family, number 1, means longing to linger. Longing to linger. It says in our text that he loved them to the end. To the end. Now I want you to understand what's going on here. Jesus knew the cross was upon him. He knew his betrayer was sitting amongst them. And in a time that most of us would be trying to escape or hide, Jesus decides, you know what? I want to eat dinner with my disciples. In fact, talking about this very meal, Jesus says this in Luke chapter 22. He says, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Jesus desired to spend this time with them. He was longing to linger as long as he could with the ones that he loved. He wanted to invest or make the most out of the time that he had. Now I want you to really let that sink in this morning. When the indescribable pain of torture and crucifixion, and maybe worse than all, the separation of him from his Father was looming, Jesus' heart was with those he loved. He made a decision to invest himself in them, and he wanted to spend as much time with them as he possibly could. The satirical site The Onion ran the following fictitious story titled, "Man on cusp of having fun suddenly remembers every single one of his responsibilities." Now here's the humorous story. This is how it read. Marshall Platt, 34, came tantalizingly close to kicking back and having a good time while attending a friend's barbecue last night. before remembering each and every one of his professional and personal obligations. Backyard sources confirm that while he chatted with friends over a relaxed outdoor meal, Platt was reportedly seconds away from letting go and enjoying himself when he was suddenly crushed by the full weight of work emails that still needed to be dealt with, an upcoming wedding he had yet to buy airfare to, and phone calls he needed to return. Platt, who reportedly sunk into a distracted haze after coming to the razor's edge of experiencing genuine joy, fully intended to go through the motions of talking with friends and appearing to have a good time, all while he mentally shopped for a birthday present for his mother, made a silent note to himself to call the bank about a mysterious recurring $19 monthly fee he had recently discovered on his credit card statement. "Everything's fine," said the tense, mentally absent man whose girlfriend asked him what was wrong after his near-giddy buzz vanished. And he remembered that he hadn't called his aunt yet to check up on her after her surgery. He said, "I'm having fun." According to sources, Platt tried to put his responsibility-laden thoughts out of his mind and loosen up, but suddenly remembered a magazine subscription that needed to be renewed by Friday, a medical bill he thought might be overdue, and the fact that he needed to do laundry by tonight or he would run out of clean socks and underwear. Now I want you to understand, Jesus, with all of the weight of the world looming, chose, even more than that, desired to spend time with those he loved. In the midst of all that, he desired to spend time with those he loved. And I bet you some are here today during this worship service and are struggling to set aside all the distractions, even at this moment, while surrounded with this faith family in the presence of God. They can't stop and enjoy it because, I wonder if someone commented on Facebook. I wonder if work called me. I wonder if that email got sent. I wonder if the bread's burning in the oven. By the way, there shouldn't be any bread in the oven. There's a meal after service. Jesus loved his disciples enough, he wanted to be with them to the very end. Let me ask you a question this morning. Do we have the same desire when it comes to the same family? I mean, are we longing to linger or are we eager to leave? The second thing that we see about Jesus' love here is that loving family means living to serve. Now, it's hard to imagine, but Jesus, while knowing his unjust public execution was right around the corner, he chose to serve. He chose to serve. I want you to think about that for a minute. Jesus washes feet, knowing that shortly his feet would be pierced. Jesus humbly gets on his hands and knees, knowing that the very mention of his name should drive all mankind to their hands and knees. In Matthew chapter 20, it says this, "It should not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus tells his disciples, you should be servants. And then he goes on and he says, and by the way, that's why I came. I came to serve. That was my very intention, to serve all of mankind. And during this meal, he shows them how much he loved them by serving them. And then he calls his disciples at the end of the meal to do the very same thing. Verses 14 and 15. "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do as I have done." Jesus displays one of the family's greatest characteristics, and that is to serve one another. In fact, just a little bit longer in the same chapter, verses 34 and 35, he says, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. And then he tells us, by this all people will know you are my disciples if you have love for one another. We got to be willing to serve one another. Rick Warren shares the story of Dan Cathy. Now, Dan Cathy is the president and CEO of Chick-fil-A. Cathy was in Southern California checking on some new Chick-fil-A restaurants that their company were building near Saddleback Church, where Rick is the founding preacher there. These two guys stopped at the construction site of a new Chick-fil-A, and here's how Rick Warren tells the story. He says, we were looking at the building, and while we were there, we were hungry, so we went next door to, I think, a Taco Bell. It was some other fast food company that was in competition with Chick-fil-A. We'd been out in the dirt, and our hands were sweaty and dirty, and so when we went into the restroom, as we went into the restaurant, to wash our hands. And this is what he said happened. After he'd washed his hand, he watched Dan Cathy wash his hands. And then Dan Cathy took out extra towels, extra sheets of towels. And the CEO of a chain of restaurants began to clean the sinks of the Taco Bell bathroom. I looked at him and I said, "Thank you for doing that, Dan." And he said, "Rick, we teach our staff to always leave any place they are at better than it was when they found it, whether it's our place or not." I want you to understand, Dan Cathy's corporate family didn't come up with that philosophy. It's a great philosophy, and I'm glad that he did it, and I'm glad that they do it, but they did not come up with it. It was originated, displayed in Jesus. And it should be the mark of every Christian life, ever since Jesus. See, Jesus loves his disciples enough to humbly serve them. And as family, we have to ask ourselves, do we have that same desire? Do we have that same desire this morning? Are we living to serve each other here today? Or are we looking for entertainment here today? I read this passage last week, Ephesians chapter 3. It is the prayer of Paul. He says this, "Your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong, and may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep His love is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it is too great to understand fully." As we try to grasp an ungraspable love that God proclaims through His Son, we need to understand that Jesus displays that very love by spending time with His faith family. He shows that very love by willingly and eagerly serving His faith family. Is that the love you and I are displaying this morning? Are you representing the family of God well by following in the very footsteps of Jesus' love?